is able to discuss with us the real impact of COVID-19 on economics, socio-economics. Therefore, on the outset, I would like to thank these great distinguished speakers for accepting our invitation to be part of this webinar so that they can instill in the minds of the participants what are the real impacts, how the economy is being affected, how the social setup in our country is being affected. It is our turn as an academician that come out with some solid research on this, the real impact of socio-economic impact of COVID-19. Therefore, once again, I thank the speakers for accepting our invitation and also all those participants. I'm sure that I see a lot of faculty around, even from other schools. I'm very happy. Let's wish each one of us that we will have a fruitful discussion this afternoon and arrive at some kind of conclusion from we as an academician, what more that we can contribute to overcome this crisis situation. So once again, I thank each one of you and thanks. I wish you all the best.
Thank you, Father, for your nice, warm introduction. Now, I'm aware of the fact that our respected panelists do not need any introduction as they are renowned economists and policy makers. So we all know them. But however, as a part of the formality, I would like to introduce them. So our first speaker is Professor Abhirup Sarkar. He is currently Professor of Economics at the Indian Statistical Institute, Kolkata. He is also the chairman of West Bengal Infrastructure Finance Corporation, a member of the West Bengal State Planning Board, and he is the chairman of the Expert Committee on Higher Education of West Bengal. And I will also definitely like to add that he was my and two of my colleagues' teacher at the Indian Statistical Institute. Thank you, sir, for being with us here. Now I would like to introduce Professor Sugata Matjit. He is currently the first distinguished professor at the Indian Institute of Foreign Trade, which is a part of Ministry of Commerce and Industries, Government of India. He is also the project director in the Center of Training and Research and Public Finance and Policy, and a member of Public Policy and Planning. He is a former director of Centers for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta. He is former chairman of West Bengal Council of Higher Education. And as many of us would know that he is also a former VC or Vice Chancellor of University of Calcutta. Currently, he is the editor of South Asian Journal of Macroeconomics and Public Finance. And here also I must mention that our colleague Dr. Sandip Sarkar has been collaborating with Professor Matjit on the distribution neutral fiscal policy for a long time. I also welcome Professor Matjit. Thank you for being with us here. Next, our speaker is Professor Saibal. He is currently Professor of Economics at the Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta. He is also the director of the Eastern Regional Center of ICSSR and a research fellow at the Institute of Labor Economics, Bonn, Germany. And here also I will mention that he taught us in the master's level at the University of Calcutta. I also thank you, sir, for coming and accepting our invitation. Last but not least, I introduce Professor Shovan, who is the current Dean of Xavier School of Economics, Xavier University Bhubaneswar. He was previously a professor at the Indira Gandhi Institute of Development Research, Mumbai. Thank you, sir. Welcome to this webinar. So before we move on to the main discussion, I want to make an announcement. First, that I am very much thankful to the participants for their enthusiasm and the responses. I think we are having approx 500 plus participants right now. And I'm happy to announce that it's really 500 plus. And now the point is that because of this huge number, it is not possible for us to attend all the questions or the queries. So I will request the participants that whatever question they will have, they can put in the Zoom chat box. They can ask us through the Facebook, because we are also streaming in the Facebook live, and they can also mail us. So, and I apologize for saying this that we can't take, but I hope you people can understand. So now I won't waste any more time. So I will request Professor Abhirup Sarkar to inaugurate the panel discussion. Professor Sarkar, please.
Thank you, Tanmoy. Thank you. My other students are also there. It's a very good opportunity to speak to a large gathering of people. Most of them are faculty members. So it's definitely a special occasion for me. I will talk about the nature of public action, government action to be more specific, against the COVID-19 crisis. Of course, the context will be India. I will try to understand how well the government has been able to tackle the problem, and what are the perhaps lacunae where more work is needed. Now, as far as COVID-19 is concerned, COVID-19 crisis, one can think of two distinct phases. One is, I'll just call it phase one, basically the lockdown phase. When the lockdown is in place everywhere, people are sitting at home without work, without income, and at the same time, migrants are struggling to get back to their home. This is the situation. So this is lockdown, phase one. And then I'll also talk about phase two, when lockdown is being gradually lifted and the economy is, resuming its normal activities, albeit gradually, not at once, but gradually we are trying hard to get back to normalcy. Now, as for phase one, the key word I think is survival. When there is complete lockdown, people are without jobs, migrants are struggling to get back, the key problem is one of survival. And as for phase two, the key word is revival. So I will make a distinction between survival and revival. So the first question is, now phase one is almost over. How well has the government, for my purpose, I won't distinguish between central government and state government. I will consider government as a whole. And the question is, how well the government, or the governments perhaps, been able to manage the problem of survival. Now here I will say, my opinion is that one can think of two distinct class of people again, the migrants and the non-migrants. The non-migrants are those who have lost their jobs, but they're staying at home without income perhaps. For them, I think the problem of survival has been managed reasonably well. Why do I say that? Well, simply because there are very few reporting of actual starvation. Very few starvation. People somehow have got enough to eat. We have not heard about, deaths due to starvation or even widespread hunger. There are several reasons for this. The primary reason, in my opinion, is the more or less smooth functioning of the public distribution system. If you compare the present crisis with the Bengal famine, for example, which took place in the 1940s, no rationing system was there. And now we have a fairly widespread rationing system. People are getting 5 kilograms of food grains, 1 kilogram of dal, and that is sufficient. People are not starving, in my opinion. However, for the other group of people, the migrants, there are several problems. The main problem is that we had very little knowledge about the migrants. Even the census, the 2011 census, the data on migrants have been processed very recently. I just got to take a look at the main tables just yesterday. And even that data is terribly incomplete, meaning that we have very little idea about who is working where, who is migrating where, what is the total quantum of migrants, and so on and so forth. So, in a sense, we were completely unaware of this migration problem, of the problems the migrants might face. And there, I think there has been a serious government failure. So just to repeat, as far as non-migrants are concerned, I think the governments, the central government and the state governments taken together have been reasonably successful to support a starving population. But for migrants, there has been serious failures. So that is my take on phase one. That is, which is where I said the keyword is survival. Let us now talk about phase two, which is revival. Now, lockdown is being lifted gradually, and of course, we have to, we have to undertake the very hard task of putting the economy in its normal mode, and that is no easy task. So when we talk about revival, three things come to my mind. First is revival of the supply side. The supply chain needs to be revived. Production needs to start. Distribution has to be in place. This is one. The other is demand side revival. I will talk about that, exactly what I mean by demand side revival. But in a nutshell, since people are jobless, since people are without work, since people do not have income, there could be a demand efficiency problem. Even if supply is there in the market, people might not have the purchasing power to buy them. So that is the demand side management. And finally, the third thing that is important is financing. This whole revival program needs crores and crores of rupees. And how does one finance that requirement? It's not an easy job. So we will talk about supply side, demand side, and financing. Let's talk about supply side first. Here, supply is being disrupted because of two reasons. One is there is a lack of capital. You see, for any firm of any size, small firm, medium firm, large firm, the income flow has been stopped. But for all these firms, usually these firms are borrowers from the market. They have to pay back their loans. But without any inflow of income, it is hard to pay back your loans. So there is a problem of revival of capital flows. And the government has come up with some measures. They have provided moratorium first for 3 months, and then it has been extended to 6 months. And more credit flows have been announced by the finance minister to the MSME sector. MSME has been chosen because they are the ones who are providing employment on a large scale. So to take care of smooth capital flows, the government has announced moratorium and has also announced smooth credit flows to the MSME. So hopefully that should take care of the capital problem. But there is another problem, which is, in my opinion, which is more important because of the COVID disease itself. It is a labor problem. It is the revival of the labor flows that is important. So the problem is very simple. People cannot go to their place of work because of the COVID fear, because public transports are not available. So in my opinion, to make labor flows smooth, the governments, the central government as well as the state governments, I'm not making any distinction between them again, governments should consider giving transport subsidies, because it's of immense importance that people go to their place of work. With 50% or even 60% people going to the place of work, or people going to their place of work, let's say 3 times a week, that cannot bring back normalcy. So I think the policymakers should seriously think about reviving the public transport system. Now we talk about demand. You see, there are demand problems. Why? Because consumption, first of all, consumption demand is likely to be affected because of an increase in the propensity to save. There is widespread uncertainty everywhere. So people do not know when they will lose their jobs, and therefore they have a higher propensity to save. And that sort of puts a constraint on the amount of consumption that people will undertake. The other component of demand is investment. Again, investment demand is likely to be low because of this uncertain environment. And if demand does not pick up, the credit policy that the government has announced is going to be useless. Because as a firm, if I know that I cannot sell my goods, I'm not going to take any loan. I'm not going to pay back my loans either. So it is important to manage the demand problem. Now, how does one boost up demand? Economists, many economists, and very famous ones, have talked about direct money transfers. Now here, I will differ a little bit. Money transfer for survival, I can understand. But that has been taken care of by distribution of food. So no more money transfer is required for survival. But if you are thinking of money transfer, income transfer for reviving demand, then there is a problem, I think. First of all, there are precautionary savings. If I get a one-time transfer, I might as well save a large part of that money for future emergencies. And also, in economics, we are all aware of the permanent income hypothesis of Milton Friedman. That is, if you have a one-time increase in income, then you tend to smooth out. Your current consumption increases by a very small amount. So I think just one-time transfer of income cannot revive demand. What you have to do is a better, much better thing to do is to revive public works. Just government works. Government had announced to enhance the infrastructure, Indian infrastructure, by a large amount. I think the government should keep its promise. If public works are undertaken, then people can be employed in a at least in a semi-permanent position. And that will increase their permanent income, or at least semi-permanent income, which can boost demand, consumption demand. One last thing I will say about financing. The government is planning to sell public assets to finance this crisis, to finance the measures that it has announced. I think it is not a good time to sell public assets because, given widespread recession all over the world, you are likely to get a very low price for the assets. This is not a good time to sell. So the government should resort to other means. For example, there is nothing wrong, at least in my opinion, there is nothing wrong in increasing the national debt. The central government is encouraging everyone to take more loans, including state governments. So why doesn't the central government take more loans itself? And the other is increasing taxes for the super rich. People have talked about that, but so far we have not seen it happening. So that is roughly what I wanted to say. Government has been successful in certain respects. It has not been successful in other respects, and the crisis goes on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Sarkar. Now, I would like to know the view of Professor Matjit on this topic. So, Professor Matjit, if you may.
So, yes, thank you very much for inviting me to your this gathering and to share views regarding the socio-economic consequences of this massive problem that this country and the world is passing through. I shall, of course, agree with most of the points that Professor Sarkar has made. So essentially, I have no comments on those issues. So let me try to focus on certain specific problems, which I think involves medium to long-term revival of the Indian economy and certain basic structural transformation that we are likely to see for the Indian economy. And in a way, it's quite uncertain how we are going to tackle those problems. First, I'm going to talk about a very concrete, down-to-earth health issue, which is, quite worrisome at this stage. You see, what has happened, if you look at the broad data of COVID-19 infections, active cases and death rates, etc., across states and of course for the country as a whole, you will see that now, particularly in the last 7 days, and also we are kind of apprehending that for the whole month of June or in July, there will be increasingly rising cases of infections in this country, and that we can see that every day there is a record because it's a convex curve with the second order conditions is also positive as we are moving with more infections. See, the problem is not in the death rate. Some people are talking about death rates as low in India and so on. What I'm worried about, and I think many people are worrying about this, is that our health infrastructure, for example, to give you very concrete example, number of seats in hospitals, public hospitals, private hospitals, you take together, they are not capable of handling a huge number of infections if a very small percentage of infections comes to the hospital for treatment. Because what is happening is that increasingly, the hospitals are being filled up. In fact, I have information that in big metropolis, you know effective costs of getting a hospital bed is increasing through the roof. It is also important to realize that beside COVID-19, we have many more complex diseases that or regular diseases that affect the citizens. And nowadays, if you want to get a treatment of those diseases, those are not getting the right kind of priority, because the health infrastructure in this country actually is remarkably inadequate compared to the size of the population. So it is very important, and you can understand that only when, I think, individually you are exposed to that problem. So it is really critical that how the governments, state governments, central government, and so on, how they are arranging for rapid increase in the infrastructure in hospitals or hospital-like arrangements for all states, and particularly for the metropolitan places where the rate of infection is much higher compared to many other places. So it is, more I see as number of people going back home, uh, after getting rid of this infection. But more I'm worried about the fact that if if the standard percentage of this COVID increasingly infected people do not get proper hospital facilities, you know, not only the death rates will increase, but you see you can easily see that the weakest point or the weakest part or the weakest segment of our fight against the COVID will be, health infrastructure. So I think this is a very important point, and I hope that the governments are looking at it. Yes, they are trying to expand facilities, but God help us, because if the infection rate goes up with this rate, then it is not possible to contain everybody at home with sort of health in health matters, and they have to be taken to hospitals. So that is a big problem that I foresee, and I think that this is we should be aware of. The second issue, because these issues that I'm talking about would be kind of scattered, because I'm not going to sort of take one sort of line of argument and develop that. The second issue, again, I think, which is very important, is the way that the states are going to finance their deficits. Because, like the central government, the states do not have access to certain kind of financing of public expenditure. For example, states cannot go to the RBI and borrow directly from the RBI. So that states cannot take share of the newly printed money. States cannot monetize their fiscal deficit. States cannot, lay hands on a lot of resources that the central government can. And this is going to be a big problem for the state, because till now it is almost like the states are begging resources from the center. Now, this should not have happened after 70 years or 75 years of independence. That there have to be certain, instruments in the hands of the state government, so that they can actually exercise their choice during this kind of national or state level disaster. In fact, certain number of finance ministers have posed this question to the central government. The point that I'm trying to make is that first, it is not very transparent how this new financial package of 20 lakh crores, if it is there, how it is financed by different sources of financing, as it has been pointed out by Professor Sarkar. We do not know how much the government is willing to take loan, because some of these help in terms of financial resources are in terms of credit, and if you don't take the credit effectively, you don't have to, the government doesn't have to make any provision. So the financial provision of the states, of the central government, should be very transparent for mending the fiscal deficit, which, compared to the last announcement of the budget from 3.8 to 4%, it must have gone above 10%. In fact, very conservative estimate of nominal fiscal deficit to be 11 to 12%. So the question is, where from these resources will come? And if these resources can come easily to the government of India, when the states face remarkable shrinkage in their available resources to combat COVID, because in many ways states also do not run on surplus resources. The question, therefore, given the fact that the states cannot print money, how one should expect that the states should raise resources? Now, one possibility that has been talked about is that, of course, states' borrowing capacity has been increased, from I think 3% to 5% of GDP. But as the finance minister of Kerala has mentioned rightly, that in the time of crisis, if you want to issue a fresh bond, who is going to pick it up? They can only pick it up if the interest rate is very, very high. And that's the problem of raising finance at the time, in bad time, that you cannot go to the market and do it. So basically the government has to think of ways so that it can get, if it has to borrow extra, the state governments need certain kind of uh, uh, best practice alternatives that can actually help them. So the financial, the position of the state government should be properly evaluated, and their fiscal deficit, how that can be monetized through direct borrowing from RBI and things like that, that has to be discussed at the national level. So I am not seeing that these type of issues are being talked about in public domain, which I don't think is right. Uh, the other thing that I'm going to talk about is actually how the economy, or how the Indian economy will look like when, suppose we have a vaccine, and suppose that we go into the next year, because I cannot improve the estimate what has been given by World Bank or IMF or ADB, that on both financial years, the one which is in progress and the next financial year, fiscal year, our growth rate is bound to be negative. So it is meaningless to talk about positive growth rate, so on. Next 2 years you have to be happy with zero growth rate, and you have to be happy with the fact that if the GDP does not fall below a certain level. Already the GDP has crashed to a very large extent, and we are hoping that with this some respite from the lockdown, there will be some kickback in the rate of growth. But that is really not the concern now, because there are more important issues. But one must, as economists, sort of contemplate or imagine how there will be structural economic transformation in this country. Now, it is very important to realize that in India, people are essentially are not law abiding. That's why the lockdown process, and when the lockdown process is kind of lifted to some extent, you can easily see the experiences from social media, from print media, television, and so on, that people just don't care to be protective about themselves, and they don't care that not being protective about themselves, they are going to ruin the health of others in the system. So it is beyond of course not imagination, given the fact whatever the government asks us to do, we are not used to doing that. We try to find out ways and means not to do that. But that's what we should keep in mind, because eventually the workplaces, production organization, whatever you think now, including rearrangements in restaurants, to how the shop floor will actually work, you will see that companies are going to enforce social distancing to some extent. And if they do it, that would completely change the way we organize production. One consequence of that is going for technologies which do not require many human beings. In fact, I always try to cite this example that now in a full-fledged, you know, big scale cement factory, you do not employ even more than 5 people. I was amazed to sort of know this from one of my friends that such has become the process of automation. And this was before COVID-19 affected India. So now what you are going to expect is that there would be a lot of interest and encouragement towards technologies which do not require people. You know, the activities where people have to stay together and work, these activities will be affected to a very large extent. In fact, there is different evidence in different parts of the world that where the population density of economic activities are high, those economic activities are worst hit by the COVID-19, and they therefore would have the worst time in terms of recovery. So, these days people are talking about, restaurants, business, and so on by saying maintaining social distancing and this and that, etc. But mind you, India survives on the strength of big consumer market at various levels of expenditure. And that is one of the lifeline of the Indian economy. We cannot deny the fact that the crowded spots in markets, crowded spots in during lunch hours, in office places and so on, and typically, in traditional industries, crowded spots are very common in production organization. And how that is going to be affected after Corona or during Corona as we go into the lockdown, we don't know. In fact, this would be a very critical thing for measuring the extent of the recovery that the Indian economy can expect, and that's what I am becoming very, very pessimistic. In fact, my point is that until and unless you have a solid vaccine and very, very sort of effective vaccine available to all, and one can access it easily, there would be certain consequences of this natural disaster caused recession that cannot be solved overnight, because you can easily see one example would be the macroeconomic example that people nowadays in India is an excessively consumer oriented economy. In India, the saving rate to GDP aggregate is 31%, for China is 46%. Just compare these two. Now, I'm not saying that an aggregate measure will give you what is our own propensity to save, because that might depends on different levels of income. But the fact is that once people are scared, like they would remain scared in general till the vaccine is coming up, as long as that is possible, that is there, they are going to increase their savings, and therefore, the multiplier effect is not going to work that much. So the whole question is that if we had a lot of savings, maybe we could have tackled the our loss of income well. But government of India never provides us with household level savings data, and it is talked about as if 50% of Indian population are living in debt. So the fact is, if there is a disaster, this kind of natural disaster comes, everybody just waves their hands and say that we don't have stocks to deplete, to replenish. So I mean to get help from. So the idea is that a strong vaccine, a very effective vaccine, accessible vaccine is needed for sort of least cost transformation of the economy. But at this stage, I am really scared and skeptic about the problems we are going to face in next 6 months. It's not a problem of that the lockdown is not being lifted and the work activities will not come up. It's a problem of transportation. It is problem of how production is organized. It is problem of essentially the health and hygiene requirements in workplaces and so on. So I do not know how we are going to tackle this. These would be interesting areas of investigation, and I believe.
Sir, you are muted. No, it's okay. It's okay.
Okay, yeah. So as long as people think about it and people try to investigate the consequence of this kind of shocks, the consequence of this kind of transformation, to this unnatural economic and social shock, I think it will be interesting food for thought for the economists. And I believe that we have to live with hope, but the uncertainty, the extent of uncertainty is so much that we can only contemplate and just sort of throw stones in the dark. But we have to at least know which target we are actually throwing the stones at. So that is what I think is important. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Matjit, for wonderful your speech. Now, I would like to request Professor Shoeble Kaur to give his views. Professor Kaur.
Once again, good afternoon to all the speakers, Chancellor of your university, Honorable Dean, whose invitation I received. Thank you so much for the kind invitation. I'll just, yeah, that's fine. So, and thanks to, of course, Tanmoy and Sandip for organizing this whole thing. I believe it's going to be a very fruitful session, and I'm typically in the elite circle that I have learned so much from Professor Sarkar, Professor Matjit, and I have always been, enthralled by the ideas that have come up in the discussions with Professor Matjit and Sarkar from time to time. What I'm going to talk about, and I discussed this thing partly with Sandip last evening, that I'm going to show you a model of regional specialization and regional mobility, particularly in view of the migration related issues that have come up so compelling to our lives in so many ways during the lockdown and as an outcome of the COVID-19 pandemic throughout the country. So I would try to assume that some of you would follow and actually go along with me in trying to explain a structure. If you are not happy with the technicalities of it, don't bother about it. I'm still going to tell you the main tenets of what this regional economy models might actually be of essence and of some importance in view of how crisis can lead to relocation of workers from one place to another, given that they have already been moving from one place in search of jobs or higher pay and things like that. So as a matter of fact, I would show you three things. One, I would talk about the basic structure of the economy. I would talk about the kind of fiscal transfers that are given by the center to the states, as well as the expenditures made by both center and state on both revenue and capital expenditures across India from time to time over a span of long 20 years since 1991 and so on and so forth, just to motivate the fact that, and also to complement certain things that and Sugata actually gave it an even more important impetus at helping me out in going through what I'm trying to say here, is that infrastructure is an important element in this whole debate about how economies suffer from an economic crisis like we are seeing right now, and their way out of such crisis in the medium to long run by say 2021 and so on and so forth. So some of the essential components that I'm going to discuss about are the unskilled labor, their mobility issues, the skilled labor, wherever they are being utilized and wherever they are stuck during this pandemic, as well as the follow-up and growth of infrastructure across regions in the country, which has an influence on the production of commodities where both skilled and unskilled labors are directly used. So before I go into that, I'll share my screen. I'll start off with certain basic discussions of the development impacts of the COVID-19 crisis and the regional mobility issues. So I will do the slideshow and go on to the the PowerPoint presentation here. I hope most of you can see this. It's some right up here, and if you would kindly allow me, it wouldn't take more than 15 to 20 minutes. I would read through some of these writings, because given so many participants here, if I just show you the slides and talk side by side, it is very difficult to communicate over the Zoom, because it's not a platform where I can see how the participants and the audience is actually getting communicated with in terms of the points I'm trying to make. So, as you have already seen, a large number of individuals, predominantly unskilled workers, have moved from one point to another during the economic crisis. So, like I said, this is going to complement and extend some of the arguments made by Professor Sarkar and Professor Matjit, with a particular focus on regional mobility of workers and how regional development has got everything to do with it, including formation and creation, as well as sustenance of infrastructure facilities in particular regions. Okay. So according to some estimates, the movement is to the tune of 80 million individuals in the last 2 months that has happened across different states in the country. So basically, what is at stake? First of all, it means that so many individuals at some point moved out of their source region in search of jobs, and in some cases, higher pay, the wages that they do not get in their locations where they are from, that's a source, right? Or it could be both. Number one, it could be lack of jobs in the same location that they're in, as well as higher wages and higher pay in another location, which has made them move about across different parts of the country. And this is, of course, not restricted to the country alone. People have moved out. People regularly move out to the Gulf areas, from Kerala, from even our Malda, Murshidabad, from Odisha, from different other parts of, from UP and all other parts of the country in search of jobs and higher pay. But I am focusing especially on the regional distribution within the country, so that we can really focus on the question of the migration within the country and how migrants have actually gone back and forth between locations during this particular crisis. So what caused this great migration within the country is important. There's no doubt about it. But what can reverse this trend is perhaps equally important in view of similar crisis in future. Because once the lockdown happens, once the borders are sealed down, right, and there are possibilities that new opportunities do not open up in other places, the whole onus is on the locations from where they belong to create jobs and to keep them in some form of activity involved. Otherwise, there would be complete chaos within the system. There would be requirement for moving out, and there would be artificial stoppage on that. This is something one cannot afford in a democratically elected government, using a federal structure within the country to administer and accommodate this kind of activities. So I show that infrastructure affects formation of skill and retention of skilled workers. This is the part I'm going to use as a regional model. This is a model which I used recently in a volume published by Omid Wattobal and another person from University of Amsterdam. It came out, so you will see some equations with chapter numbers in them. It's nothing but because I copied directly from the chapters. Many of my staff are still with my institution. I couldn't bring them over back home. So in any case, I'll keep on explaining one by one the intricacies of how this regional economy model has to do with the regional mobility of factors of production. Now, this access to infrastructure and the use of it can be directly extended to unskilled labor also, and the effects on the unskilled, as I find out for the results, is staggered during the pandemic, whereas the effect on skill is less so. This is one of the main tenets. If you don't go through the technicalities of it, this is something we take home. So short-term unemployment, it would mean, according to some studies and some surveys that have come out, which is, of course, I should mention, it is a privately run survey, and I have personal worries about the quality of this survey, because this was done on only 3,500 respondents across the country. You can imagine that a small sample like this, and people like Sandip, Tanmoy, all of you have been in Indian Statistical Institute. You would agree with me in the first place that a small sample as 3,500 for a country like India is probably very unrepresentative or non-representative of the true picture. Yet, people have found, or that particular institution have found, that close to 12 crore, which is about 120 million jobs, have been lost in the past 3 months, of which roughly 80 million jobs belong to migrant workers alone. This is a serious amount. 80 million jobs is equivalent to German population, right? So for a country on a sudden impetus, so many jobs lost, has to have a micro as well as a huge macroeconomic crisis already in the process, or just waiting in the fringes to become much more severe as we slowly go out into the from the lockdown. Now, it implies that the people who have gone in for the jobs was actually because of the fact that it's still the fact that capital draws in workers. This was more like the Barlow's report, and I hope Professor Matjit and Professor Sarkar, Professor Ray might remember that this was after the Second World War. A report came out. I mean, not by not like you were there, but just if you have come across this kind of information, a report came out that in England the government was trying to relocate people to places which are war ravaged, but nobody wanted to go. It had to be the case that investments went to those war ravaged places first, and then people followed. So it's more like people follow capital rather than capital seeing the opportunity to come and use a large stock of unskilled and skilled labor in a particular location. So this process seems to be still in practice and still in vogue in a country like India, where more economic activities, larger and richer set of capital stock actually keeps on attracting workers from rest of the country. So it could be Punjab, it could be Maharashtra, it could be parts of Gujarat, which attracts workers from rest of the country just because they are more capital rich compared to some of the other states in the during the same contemporary time period. So the similar capital, the draw of capital can possibly be applied to the draw of infrastructure, which regulates the stock and flow of workers in a almost similar or analogous fashion. Now, what would mean by human capital, and this is important just for the sake of if there are younger students here, you would know that some of these statements are by none less than Professor Gary Becker himself, which says that any analysis based on human capital, and why am I actually talking about human capital suddenly here? Because we are going to talk about the use of skill in certain sectors and how skill is trapped in locations. And even if they wish to go back, even if they want to go back during the pandemic, they are not going to be able to do that because infrastructure is short in places which they have actually left for a longer term appointment and longer tenure in some of the states. So what would human capital actually mean in this case? Any analysis based on human capital assumes that individuals maximize welfare, and you would see that these words carry importance even right at this moment as they conceive of it, whether they be selfish, altruistic, loyal, spiteful, or even masochistic in their appeal or applications to their own self optimizing behavior. Their behavior is also forward looking, and it is also consistent over time, right? So if you reflect on the current situation, you would see that skilled workers who are endowed with certain levels of human capital are probably thinking along this kind of definitional categories that we are creating, a la Gary Becker, Jacob Mincer, and many other people who have worked on this issue. In particular, the individuals who are endowed with human capital, they try as best to anticipate the uncertain consequences of their action. Number two, forward-looking behavior, as they show, is still rooted in the past. For the past can exert a long shadow on attitudes and values, which basically means that if they have moved from one place to another in search of high-skilled jobs, it's dependent on their past and the past behavior which they have witnessed and which have actually influenced their behavior as of now. Actions are constrained by income, time, imperfect memory, and so on and so forth. I'm not going further into that. These opportunities are largely determined by the private and collective action of other individuals and organizations, right? So, given this spectrum of human capital and unskilled laborers resources that's available at the regional level, do I see that the social sector spending, as Professor Sarkar briefly mentioned, through infrastructure development, through public provisions of the capital goods regions, has anything to do with it? You see, the budgetary allocations seem to have gone down since the post-reform period, right? So if you look at the first column on the top, I'm putting my cursor here, the plan, non-plan as it used to be called then, and the plan, non-plan as it used to be called later on after the reforms, have typically changed for revenue expenditure, which is up here, and capital expenditure. So much of the expenditure that's being spent by the government, central and state, is for revenue and maintenance expenditure, much less for creation of capital. Okay, so it has gone down from 12.41 pre-reform to 9.87 post-reform, 33.839 pre-reform to 20.67 post-reform. And this is, an earlier data. I'll update it with up to 2014-15 in the next slide and so on. If you follow it up with typical social sector spending by central and state governments, you can again see that pre-reform, it was 54.7 by the central government. It has come down to 45.8 in the post-reform period. Again, it's early 2000s, but still the drop is clearly noticeable. For the state governments, the pre-reform, the expenditure was about 70.2 on social sector spendings. It went down to 63.2. Overall, there was about 6 to 8% drop in the social sector spending. How about the pattern of public sector plan outlay? This has also gone up and down, and particularly between outlays and actual, there has been some improvement, but not necessarily a continuous improvement as you would expect. With country getting richer and more endowed, you would have expected more to go into this kind of spending, which hasn't. So what if what we talk about the social sector expenditure by states and center, you would see that when the states have over time, and this is up to 15-16, if you update the data to 17-18 or 19-20, you would see that there's not a significant change in the pattern that I've already shown in this particular table. You see that the states tend to spend little more compared to the center, which was spending about 1.13% of the GDP in 1991, went up to about 1.89 in 2010-11, and then went down back again to 1.67 by 2015-16, right? So it's like a roller coaster thing, going up and going down. Overall, as the GDP is expanding, we are trying to talk about large trillion dollar economies. What's happening to the percentage being spent on the social sector is still going down. So on the whole, you would see that the capital formation and the expenditures on social sector at the state level and the central level, which Professor Matjit talked about slightly, where do we get the money to spend on social sector activities and other things at the state level, are at the are really suffering from this particular trends. If you look at the NREG expenses, which the current situation is probably a way out for people who have come back from their from the locations where they worked as migrant workers and back to their local regions. I mean, government is probably depending a large on NREG expenses to cater for this kind of people. But this has also changed in terms of all the expenses incurred at the state level varies, right? So it's not like that you go to any state and you find 100 days job or even more than 100 days job easily, given the allocations already made by the government, easily implemented, not done. Not so easy to be implemented as of now, because the amounts already allotted to these sectors might not really accommodate the additional demand for such jobs when the migrants do come back from their locations to their origins. So, given this motivation, if you would allow me briefly, let me just go ahead and walk you through a short model, which is about a model of regional production and mobility of workers. Professor Ray, do I have like 5 or 6 minutes? If I do, I'll just go ahead quickly. No, so consider.
You can continue. You can continue.
Okay, thank you so much. So consider a developing country with J regions indexed in a continuum. Each region of the country has the potential to produce two goods: a traditional industrial product and which is X indexed by J, and a function of unskilled labor only with usual, convergence conditions that, that the second orders are negative. So you get a smooth concave production function, and the output Yj, which is that of a modern sector, uses skill as the main ingredient along with infrastructure I. So unlike the region-specific endowment of unskilled labor, the supply of skilled labor is, however, dependent on how much infrastructure in that particular region J is made available for production and use of skilled labor. This is given by SSJ, as in, I'm going to show you the equations in 1 second. So let us define WHJ as the skilled wage in determined region J. This is very region specific. WJ is the unskilled wage determined in region J, and KJ is the price per unit of infrastructure in region J. Okay, I call it autarkic because it's almost like saying that if suddenly, due to a COVID outbreak, borders are sealed down, then states become almost like in an autarkic state. You don't trade with anybody, you just produce and consume within the region, within the state, and that too in a restricted fashion. So it's more like you are cut off from the rest of the world, you are on your own, and then the regional economies have their own dimensions to be explored. That's the formal structure. So you see equation 12.1, like I said, it was from a chapter which I just, copied and pasted here. It's my own work in a book volume, so it's perfectly legal, I would say. So XJ is the production of the traditional good, which could be agricultural, and production of agriculture and allied stuff. YJ is the advanced good, which requires both skill and infrastructure. SJ, which is the skill production, is a function of how much infrastructure endowment that region J has. LSJ is, of course, dependent on the endowment of unskilled labor in that region, and infrastructure is also an outcome of the infrastructure endowment in that particular region. Equation 12.6 tells you the utility function of a representative consumer, who consumes both X and Y. I will not use too much of that. I'll just go on to the production side first. So let's come to equation 12.7, which is basically suggestion that if the profit in sector XJ, if you can see my cursor, it's right here above the blue arrow, pi XJ is a function of the amount of labor used in that sector, the wage paid in that sector, the amount of unskilled labor used, and the price paid, right? So it's very clear. You can tell how much the labor demand is, which is basically equation 12.7, which is a negative function of if the wages grow, the demand is definitely going to fall, the standard labor demand curve coming out of it, okay? And in case of full employment, if that region is fully employing all of its unskilled workers, then the wages is determined from the equality of the endowment and the labor demand, which is basically equation 12.8. Now, 12.8 shows that as the endowment of unskilled labor rises in the J8 region, the equilibrium wage falls. You can directly see from 12.8. If you have questions in this about this model, my email is available. You can easily Google me and you can send me any questions you have in this case regarding this structure. On the other hand, if the price of this commodity PX goes up, you can see that there's a positive impact on the unskilled wage in equilibrium. What happens due to COVID? So COVID-19 and lockdown can give rise to two subsequent situations. One, PX being the price of the commodity produced by the unskilled labor, and the price may temporarily rise as the regional lockdown happens. Now, if we do hit the market, we saw that right before the lockdown, prices actually went up. Let me give you an example. It's more like saying that before the lockdown kicks in, it's like your potato, your tomatoes and onions are lying in the field, right? And you know a lockdown is going to happen, your trade is going to stop, and you need to pull that up out of the field and somehow keep a stock on that, put it on storage, right? So you would make these workers go work harder, even willing to pay them a higher wage, because you know that the prices of things are going to go up because the supply is going to be snapped at some point in time, which is going to happen very soon. You don't know exactly when, but at some point. So this may raise wage in the short run, although the real wage of unskilled workers might actually fall. So the wage response might not be as high as the price response. That's my conjecture. If we had better data about the labor and the prices in India at this point, one could actually reflect on what exactly happened to the unskilled workers during this particular phase. Number two, once the local supply is exhausted, there is no production. So the field is exhausted, the stock is exhausted, there's nothing to harvest, there's nothing to produce, PX falls to zero and workers seek to return home. You see, as PX goes down to zero here, as you can typically tell, this is childish almost, but WJ star becomes zero, right? Now you see that workers stayed back for 1 month, 1.5 months. Nobody wanted to come back then. I don't know what were the actual physical restrictions or frictions about their coming back, but there was much less of a drive to come back home in the initial phases because they thought it would continue for a while. There was no clear instructions from the government about when it's going to get lifted. So they continued for a while because if production starts back, they would keep earning their wages. When the production stopped, they wanted to come back later. So it's like a staggered effect. You stay back and then you want to come back to your origin. The time span involved about this staggering effect actually depends on the Jth region's size and other factors like infrastructure. So skilled workers, this is the last 2 slides. Skilled workers case is slightly different. So I've explained the unskilled workers case. Let me just briefly tell you about the skilled workers. The case of skilled workers is different in the sense that the total cost of producing Yj is according to the infrastructure price Kj per unit and the skilled wage Wsj. Now, if you maximize the profit in sector Y, which according to the region is produced given the endowment of skill and infrastructure, is equation 12.9. You see that there is some kind of a slackness condition involved here because I don't know how much skill is produced in that region given the infrastructure constraint. So I allow for some mismatch between the endowment and the demand, which is the reason for these slackness conditions, right? So this is standard procedure. Any exposure to standard micro, undergraduate micro will tell you that this is the way we know that unless endowments are constant and fixed, we have to make some allowance of adjustment over space and time. So this goes on, we solve for it. I'm not going into the details of the solution of this, but essentially in the same way as I solve for the unskilled wage, I solve for the endowment of skilled wage as required, the demand for skilled workers as used in sector J and requirement of infrastructure as used in region J in equation 12.10 and 12.11, right? So this is a demand for skill and infrastructure in region J. You solve for it, you choose the slackness conditions, you go for it, solve for it, and go all over it. You find the final WSJ. What's important here is that if equation 12.9, as I showed you already, is an unconstrained maximization, that there is no constraint about infrastructure creation and skill as an outcome of how much infrastructure is available in a particular region J, then WSJ is a solution to skilled wage in that particular region. What does it tell us? It tells us that under the unconstrained case, infrastructure in equilibrium in region J is more than the requirement or the endowment in Jth region I tilde J. This further implies that the unconstrained wage W prime Sj is greater than the constrained wage is greater than the unconstrained wage. But despite such potential wage differences prevailing across regions, mobility of skilled workers will not take place toward the unconstrained region because infrastructure cannot be transferred along with skilled workers. So I'm trying to reflect, somewhat. I am not sure how clear I am because, it probably pays off to be present physically and explain through, some body language perhaps. But in any case, this is probably going to supplement Professor Sarkar's point that infrastructure development, as the government had promised, the going back to public works would probably mitigate the infrastructure gap that exists between two regions, one where the constraint is present, one where it isn't, right? And despite the fact that, think about Northeast, there's a lack of infrastructure facility, yet the skilled wages are extremely high there. Why don't people just live there? Because infrastructure cannot support or employ the amount of skill that can still pay you higher wages, but there's not enough jobs to be had, right? So skilled workers move out to Bangalore, they go to Noida, they go to Pune and find jobs there. They're not going to come back to Northeast, even if the fact exists that Northeast is least affected by COVID. They're not going to come back, but the unskilled labor are definitely going to come back because they have exhausted their resources over there. So this is what I had to say. In light of the COVID-19 related disruptions, therefore, it is probably not expected that skilled workers will return to respective origins, even if production stops everywhere and no trade between states, I would mean by that, takes place. In case of strong family networks and availability of social capital, the results may be different. So this is a way one can possibly explore that people might come back if social cases are much more compelling for these workers and actually help them to retain the status back home. Okay, so I'll just stop sharing now. I'm going back to the screen, and I hope I've actually taken more time than I'm allotted, but I wanted to make a regional economies do really differ in terms of the infrastructure, skill and unskilled capacities, which makes this pandemic a real problem in terms of migration between regions and why skilled workers would be stuck, unskilled workers would be mobile. This is not something we can avoid unless the infrastructure are paralleled up across regions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Kaur, for your wonderful presentation and so much informative information. So I would like to move forward and I will request our Dean, Professor Shovan Ray, to say something regarding this topic. So Professor Ray.
Thank you very much. I thought being the last speaker, I will have very little to say, but you know, I find that I will have something to say because I'm going to cover a ground which is probably not being covered by the three very distinguished speakers. One reason I've chosen to cover this is because there, I believe, a lot of young students and some young teachers also there waiting to hear some of the ground realities. I'm saying that others have also spoken, but I'm going to speak about the farm economy and how the labor comes about and so on. And I'm going to discuss a little bit of that. And Professor Abhirup actually started off by saying there are two types of people we are going to deal with, which is one is the normal residents, the other are the migrants. In fact, that's the right starting point. And I'm going to show that these two groups are very, very closely intertwined. Okay, and that is the narrative that I'm going to define here. And the other reason why I'm doing this is because I'm going to touch the ground of the areas like Odisha and parts of Bihar, parts of West Bengal, where a lot of socially deprived and poor people live, and they migrate and the work. And very correctly, it was said, observed, that capital, labor would follow capital, and that has been happening. And I think, if I've heard correctly, Professor Saibal at the last instance, my view is going to be that at the moment there is no vaccine, there is no drug to cure. Hopefully in a few months there will be. And from past records that I have studied, I take the view that the migrants, most of them would return back to where they have come. And I have done studies about 20 years back to show that, and including the things that Prime Minister said about the Bhuj tragedy and super cyclone of Orissa, which took place about 2 decades back, and so on, and many other things, from which I've done a huge study, 11 country study. I was a country leader for India about 20 years back, FAO study, and that was 11 countries, and we found that that has actually happened. So I assume there will be at the end of the tunnel, there'll be light. We will have a vaccine probably not too far away, maybe a year from now. But my position is that there is no scope. This is what I say, intertwined between the residents and migrants. So they will have to go back. There is no scope for them to be absorbed here. Now, since there are a lot of students and young teachers, I would like to get back to some of the basics, which I'm sure all the panelists know, which is about the three sectors and of the Indian economy, or for that matter, any other economy. The primary, the secondary, and the tertiary or the services sector. Just point out the fact, if some students and young teachers do not remember, that in India, it is an overwhelmingly large service sector. Okay, more than 60% of the GDP is actually originating from there. But this is not the kind of, Kuznets type of, post-industrial society service sector. This is a combination of a very, very heterogeneous services sectors, which is both government, corporate services, and financial services at the same time, farm, off-farm, and many other services which are based on distress, earnings, and so on. So today, to give a very rough outline picture, our total service sector is more than 60%. Our manufacturing sector, that is the secondary sector, manufacturing, mining, and so on, less than 25%. And agriculture, actually, the GDP originating in agriculture is only about 12 or 13%. But the dependence on the rural areas and agriculture is huge, about 50% or so. So how is this happening? It's a very low productivity, and that is what is happening. Now, one of the reasons what is happening is that the typical farm size in India across the country, in places like Odisha, Bihar, and other places also very much so, but across the country, the average land's farm size is very, very low. It's just over 1 hectare, but nearly 40% of the farms are cultivated by, farm households, which are about 40%. They cultivate farm sizes which are just about 1 acre. And I think the model value would probably be closer to ½ acre than that. So together, the marginal and small farmers, they constitute more than 86% of the farms in India. We have to remember that. And they do not eke out a sufficient subsistence out of that. So today, a lot of the poverty has been removed in the country because they produce the farm products, of course, but they also combine that with a lot of other things. Today, cereals like rice, wheat, millets, and other things constitute a very small proportion of the total value of GDP produced in the country, in the farms. Okay, and milk, dairy products are a very, very important. As you know, India is the largest producer of milk and dairy products. They produce a lot of eggs, poultry, small ruminants, goats, and so on. So all these constitute part of the farm earnings, okay, of a typical household. And even that is not enough. So out of distress, they have off-farm things, off-farm productions, a little shop, a little pan ke dukan, chai, bidi, cigarette ke dukan, and little shops in the rural areas, urban areas. You go to any places, whether in Calcutta or Orissa or any of these towns, you see little shops. All these are part of off-farm, extra time. But even that is not good enough, entirely because of the distress of the farmers of the small size, and the productivity is not high. So what happens is they cannot employ all the labor. Typical old theory that we had of surplus labor. And today the surplus labor is not finding disguised unemployment, okay? they are actually moving out, and they are mostly the people who go to towns and bigger cities, whether it is Calcutta from Odisha or from Calcutta to somewhere else, or they go to Gujarat, they go to Punjab, they go to Surat, in Gujarat, they go to, so many other towns in Delhi. For instance, if I give you the example of the Odisha migrants, for a long time they have been plumbers, and from there, a lot of the Odia plumbers. Okay, from plumbers, they have become electricians, fitters, and various other things. And from there, they moved into other things, a little bit education, a little bit of training, a little bit of skill. They work now all over the country in hospitality industries, like, let us say, in Bombay, Goa, and many other places. They work in farm sectors, they work in hospitals, hotels, restaurants. They work in all these capacities, low skilled workers. They work all because they're coming out of the same place, the same farm economy, in which, if I have visited many parts of Odisha, Bihar, and Bengal, and a lot of the places you see in village India today, there are very few people, there are very few young men. They've all migrated. A lot of the feminization of agriculture that has taken place is precisely because there are no men, and a lot of the women with children, they stay at home, and the elderly people run the household, they run the farm economy, and children go to school, and the young men, young and middle-aged men, have all gone to the big towns to work. Okay, and that is the story of the intertwined markets of the migrants and the respondents. When we saw the gory pictures of the migrants returning home, this is a study that I had done, which is called, by the FAO terminology, the buffer role of agriculture. Why are the migrants returning? And they have returned in the past, whether it is super cyclone in Odisha, or whether it is the Surat plague, or it is the Bhuj earthquake about which the Prime Minister talked, and Punjab terrorism, Delhi riots, the Godhra riots, and many other things that have happened place, uncertainty, crisis. And I have firm belief in the fact that these people have come temporarily. Today in Orissa, there are 5 lakh return migrants. And I can tell you, they are not going to stay back in Orissa. Their callings are different. So they're not only intertwined with the supply side, that is a farm economy, small farm economy from which they have gone, and they're very small, they cannot afford to absorb them back. Okay, and they've honed some skills in gems and jewelry industry, as electricians, as other workers, hospitality, and so on and so forth. And they will, having honed those skills, they will go back, and the employers all want them back because they have trained them, they invested. But of course, we know very well, from the NCUS report of the late Arjun Sengupta, where he estimated that 93% of the laborers of the employed are in the unorganized sector. I mean, there have been disputes about the number. You can take 85, 90% of them. So they're very tenuous contracts and so on. And so this is the picture of the migrants. So they're very intertwined. They have to go back to Bombay, they have to go back to Delhi, they have to go back to Surat and all those things, but they're waiting for the time for that to come. I've taken down a few notes, but apart from these people, there are a huge number of landless laborers, or labor who have a little bit of land, but they're so tiny that they cannot cultivate. They actually do the reverse tenancy. They rent it out, and they become, a lot of the scheduled castes and Dalits, other types of Dalits also are landless laborers, and they have been working in farm, off-farm employment, and they also tend to migrate. So all these people will are affected in the lockdown. But let me just make a speculation. Uh, in the three sectors, the broad three sectors that we talked about, the service sector is very badly affected, and so is the manufacturing sector. But the government has come out with the reopening and certain loan schemes of the MSME sectors, about which some discussion had taken place just now. So they're okay. But I think the one good thing that has happened is, because of the nature of things, much of in my I surmise that the least affected sector of the Indian economy would be the farm sector, provided we get, and this is subject for discussion, of course, in the panel. And I think uh, provided we have a reasonable monsoon, the farm sector would be relatively safe. By farm sector, I don't mean just the crop farming crop sector, but I also mean the eggs, the dairy, and the poultry, and various other things. You know, it was very interesting when Bengal, you know, all of you are from Calcutta, when Bengal opened up the sweet shops, you know, people, you know, talked and laughed about, you know, in Bengal, sweet shops are getting opened because they can't do without shop. That's not really the reason. Derek O'Brien came on this on NDTV, and he said, which is very correct, saying that, you know, the huge amount of milk which is produced in the country, in the state, and they go waste. And we have seen that even in Odisha, they're throwing away milk. So, you know, they are dependent on milk, they're dependent on eggs, poultry, and various other things. And they are going to be relatively safe because they're part of the cottage industry, which is in the farm sector, and they're going to do reasonably well. The worst affected are the major manufacturing industry for the time being, until they go back with the new arrangement. We don't know what's going to happen. They're opening up from today. I've seen on the television in the morning that many of these you know, places are opening up. They're making arrangements. Even in Mumbai, they're opening. You know, we talked about, somebody mentioned about the transport sector opening up. Best BEST transport is opening up in Mumbai. So that is definitely going to happen. All these are happening. Services sector very badly affected because, you know, a lot of the employment is in trade, construction, and transportation, and that is very, very badly going to be affected. But I think the other things which I would like to make a few observations is that apart from this, my surmise is that these migrants, that's one of the main points that I'm going to talk about, emphasize today in this webinar. These migrants do not have scope for absorption in the economies from which they have come. These are small farm sector, and in places from which they have gone, Orissa, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, and other places, you know, they do not have either the scope for absorption or non-farm employment possibilities. So in order to hold up their income status, in order to continue with the skills that they've honed, they have to go back to their respective places. And I emphasize from the earlier studies about 2 decades back, they have gone back once the crisis is over, and they will go back, and the employers are looking forward to an opportunity for them to go. We are running short of time, but I'll wrap up. As the Dean, I have a responsibility of not taking too much of your time. Uh, so that the intertwining of the two things, one is the place from which they have come. They have, you know, while, you know, the farm sector is relatively stable, that is one reason they've come back, and they will be at least safe there in their home and hearths, but they don't have long term, because all the extra income that they garner will not be possible for them to get, and they have no scope for being absorbed as surplus labor in these places. And so that is very important. Now, There are a couple of other points I would like to mention before we move on to something else, I mean, to the discussion. One is, uh, one of the reasons why I think poverty incidence is going to be hugely, increased in this period is partly because the income, of course, has gone down for everybody, but income of the poorest strata have gone down, partly because, what I said, the unorganized sector and their contracts. Immediately as the lockdown started, they lost their jobs because you know very well they cannot work from home. Those professions don't allow for working from home like you and I, but also because they have to come back and they belong to the poorest section of the farm and landless laborers, SCs who have no land to fall upon. So they are going to be affected, and landless laborers like this. So there will be both a very sharp increase in poverty in this period as well as inequality. Inequality, I can predict, because again, the same thing, the lowest strata are going to lose their income. Therefore, if you have any measure of inequality, or inequality within poverty, which is the, say, FGT kind of measure, you will find that poverty, inequality, all these things will definitely increase. The income of the marginal farmers and small farmers will also decline, partly because of this. The other two macroeconomic issues which have already been touched upon, one of course has not been touched upon so much, but the macroeconomic issue, which is that the government has, the RBI and others have made a lot of announcements, and this is again subject to discussion with the panel, have made announcements about, say, the monetary policy. I for one believe that this is a typically Keynesian crisis. The scope for monetary policy is very, very limited. Of course, they will make a little dent, this moratorium and things like that, to the NPA. They might do a little good things for, banks and NBFCs, but they're not going to change the mood. They're not going to provide animal spirits and so on. And on the other hand, what was required is a very, very strong fiscal policy intervention. Despite all the 5 consecutive sessions of the finance minister, I don't think neither economists nor the market was very convinced, that this is going to make a dent, despite the preface by the Prime Minister saying that, 10% of the GDP, it is, that figure is being disputed, whether it is going to be anywhere near 10% of GDP. It's not 20 lakh crore. It is probably going to be little more than 1% of GDP. But I hope the government will come back with that. So we will discuss many of these issues. These are very interesting issues to discuss. The efficacy of the monetary policy, the scope for fiscal policy in this, and also, some of the social effects that is part of the agenda of this, which is the poverty, inequality, the huge unemployment, particularly of the vulnerable sections, that is going to ensure. And only 5 kilo rice, of course, PDS has been ramped up. When I was in government, I was very much part of, instrumental in government in vamping up the present method of public distribution system. I was myself very much part of it. And I know it has been ramped up from a absolutely non-existent PDS to a system which is now very, ravely reviewed as being very good system. I'm aware of that, but despite that, this is a crisis in which we need not just rice, 5 kilos of rice and 1 kilo of dal. We need a lot more of income transfers, And the other thing that is going to happen is migrants and various other things. What has happened, that's the last point I'm going to say. there are going to be social discord problems, because aspiration levels have hugely increased, okay, with the movement and mobility of people, which didn't exist about 3 decades back. So people have got a wind of how life is, how good life could be, and they're going to go back to these metro cities if they're not. And it's going to create, this is the socio-economic issues that we need to touch upon. It's going to be a lot of tensions if we don't solve this problem. And without a vaccine, without a drug uh, coming up in the next few months, we have to live with it, but we have to be prepared for the social turmoil. And despite, I mean, quite apart from many of the economic issues. Okay, thank you very much, all the panelists and all the participants. But perhaps if Tanmoy agrees, we can have a quick discussion among the panelists before we move to the questions from the participants. Is that okay, Tanmoy?
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Ray, for your session. Yeah, I will ask other distinguished panelists if they have any views to each other's argument. So kindly, we can move forward to this interaction between the panelists. That will be really good.
Yes.
So Professor Ray, Professor Sarkar, Professor Kaur, and Professor Matjit, kindly give us your view. Thank you.
Tanmoy, you are muted.
Yeah. Sorry. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yes. So I was just requesting that if we could have a panel discussion within the panelists. I mean, all the distinguished panelists gave their own views. So is there any thing we can come up with this view discussing between the panelists? So I'm asking.
So let me Tanmoy. So
yeah.
Tanmoy, can I ask?
Yeah, definitely, sir.
Okay, to the other panelists. From the questions that I raised very quickly, if others have some views, I asked specifically whether, I mean, there is somebody, I think Saibal Kaur mentioned that they'll probably have a change of vocation. I do not think so. I think they are likely to go back to where they returned from after this crisis, which I called, or the FAO called the buffer role of agriculture. So that is one. And also possibly we can touch upon the efficacy of the monetary policy and the fiscal policy that has been announced. The adequacy of the fiscal policy and the efficacy of the monetary policy, and the question of whether you expect these people to, return back to where they came from. I strongly believe that majority of them will return back. Any views on that from the other panelists?
Well, I might just chip in. Professor Ray, I did not talk about the change of vocation. So it's I basically talked about two distinct trains and paths happening for the unskilled and the skilled.
Okay. Sorry.
As a result of the infrastructure, stock of infrastructure and the endowments of skill and unskilled workers in certain places. No, but it's I think there are possibilities. In some of the other participants have also put up this question as part of their as kind of discussion, that could you think of other ways to compensate for the loss of income that these people suffered essentially by trying to move back to their places of origin and the states where they belong, not being sufficiently wealthy or farm based or endowed to keep them employed, as well as providing for them on a long-term basis. Otherwise, in the first place, they wouldn't have moved out of their local areas and their known surroundings. So my point is, yeah, it's possible that either, and I've been trying to argue that in some other forums perhaps, is that some kind of unemployment insurance, if that's agreeable to the government through certain subsidies, and then the government would actually have to get rid of the financial packages that go for maintaining the livelihood of relocated workers. If the government had some plans before to initiate some unemployment insurance by which the workers could stay wherever they are and the insurance would kick in once such crisis happens. This is usually possible for most labor market scenarios in advanced locations. We have problems in terms of, like you mentioned, with the unorganized sector. Professor Matjit and I have worked extensively on several aspects of the unorganized workforce in India, and we find that these are certain issues that remain under the table whenever it comes to the government policy, whenever it comes to discussions by certain policymakers. These are simply not touched upon, despite the fact that it becomes so compelling when a crisis like this happens.
Absolutely correct. I mean, the problem with this pandemic or the COVID crisis is other crises have come as a singular thing. And this crisis has come nationwide, internationally, everywhere. You can't run away from anywhere, everywhere. And that's the problem. Other things that I said, they have come in single episodes, plague somewhere, terrorism somewhere, you come home and you go back. But here it's a worldwide phenomenon. Unless vaccine is the way and the drugs are the way, we can't really solve this problem. But till then, we really have to see how. Yes, absolutely correct. We really have to go back to social security, but the problem with social security is that you have to generate a counter strategy, which is that in all social security, countries, welfare states, they have either taxes or they have contributions to social security, right? Which generate that. You cannot fiscally just keep on subsidizing people. So you have to raise, if you go to the Scandinavian countries, they have huge taxes, but they can depend upon that. If you go to UK and other places, you find people are getting, but that's part of either contribution you are making yourself or a combination of that and taxes. But suddenly we can't have that, but we really have to devise something, but it requires a change of ideology of the government,
Sir, can I interrupt a little bit? Yeah. Actually, we are running out of time, and we have a lot of questions are coming from the participants.
Okay, Tanmoy, I suggest we can stop after some time if you want, after panelists say, but you can extend it by 15 minutes if you want. Can you?
Okay, yeah, obviously.
Not 5:30, but 5:45, 5:50, you can extend it.
Yeah, I'm requesting or asking the other panelists if they have their views. Yeah. Otherwise, we'll move towards the question and answer phase.
Yes.
I think Professor Sarkar has some. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I have two comments basically.
Definitely.
One about what Sugata was saying. That's very interesting. Will Sugata agree with me if I say that because of this pandemic, because of labor becoming infected, could there be a long-term tendency of capital substituting labor? That is, could there be a technical progress or technical change, let's say, which will substitute labor by capital? As it is, we are having jobless growth. So this pandemic might lead to further joblessness. That is my question to Sugata. Yes. And to Professor Ray, you see, you said monetary policy might not work. I think monetary policy will not work as far as demand, boosting up of demand is concerned. However, if you consider the banking sector, they are going to face a very serious crisis, because if a lot of people are going to default at the same time because their flow of income is going to stop, then the banking sector will be in a serious crisis, and the RBI or the central bank has to do something about it.
I totally concede that NPAs would be taken care of, but reducing the repo rate was entirely unnecessary. Repo rate.
No, I agree with you there. Reducing interest rates never boosts up demand, it increases profits. I think economists understand that, but there is a lot of pressure from the industry, from the corporate sector to reduce interest rates because it simply increases profits. That's
Yeah, moratorium, accommodative policy, I can understand because of the NPA reason. You know, that definitely
yeah,
for
okay.
both banking sector as well as NBFCs, you know, that is granted. I agree entirely with you. Yeah.
I think what I'm trying to say is exactly
Can't hear you.
prediction. Oh, sorry. What I am trying to say is exactly what Professor Sarkar has preempted. He has said that there is a long-term replacement of labor by capital. There is a tendency because anyway we see automation and so on. In fact, there is a new coinage of technological change. It's called labor eliminating technological progress. You know, usually we talk about labor neutral or Higgs neutral or you know biased technological change, but now it is almost like that you know automation is kind of labor eliminating technological change, and I think that at least for a period of time, you know, if people would be, you know, the producers would try to do that because of, and this is a problem for India and countries like India because it's not really that much of a problem for countries where wage rates is already very high, but for countries where wage rates are low, and it goes back to our problem of development economics in 60s and 70s on inappropriateness of technology. You know, the technology that we use is not appropriate for our country. One just little point I should talk about the monetary policy. I think just as a sort of intrusion into Abhirup Sarkar and Shovan Roy's comments is the idea that you know that when the government spends by printing money, you know, the deficit financing is also a very Keynesian way of doing things. So the question here, repo rate again, by reducing interest rate, I don't know what kind of benefits that gives to the nation. But what I believe is that if the government goes on borrowing to spend more, because we know that in any problem of Keynesian system, any kind of recession, any kind of slowdown, the government has a big role to play. Either it has to redistribute income from the low marginal propensity consume to high marginal propensity consume group, or the government has to spend on its own. Whatever government wants to do, the resources in this case is very realistic because the government's earning has fallen. The government does not have money to spend. So what do? In that case, I think very class book, you know, and very textbook kind of you know training in terms of saying that if you could actually increase supply of money and spending, you know, fiscal spending at the same time, somehow you do not pressurize the interest rates, because if you do that, then if you cannot do that, then interest rates will go up. But that I think is a theoretical sort of point which tells you that basically government spending by printing new money is a very justified policy in this setup. But of course I completely agree with both of you that rate of decline in the rate of interest is ultimately increasing the profits. You know, basically because there are so many papers and so many works which says that reduction of interest rate does not increase aggregate investment demand and so on. So I agree, but with that kind of caveat. Thank you very much.
Sir, can we then move forward to the question and answer? Is it fine?
Yeah.
So here is Professor Pipin. He is the Dean of the Xavier School of Rural Management of Xavier University Bhubaneswar, and he has some questions to the panelists. So, Professor Pipin, you may.
First of all, I would like to congratulate Professor Ray and his team for organizing this excellent webinar. It was very interesting and exciting to listen to four eminent economists that our country is blessed with, including Professor Ray. So thank you very much for inviting us. I am a little puzzled about a few things that is happening in our country today. I am not an economist, so please pardon me if I make any mistakes in asking the following few questions. Number one is, you know, 10% of the population holds 77% of the national wealth. So therefore, my first question is, what is Indian in Indian economy? Okay, so we are all talking about migrant workers, the farm economy, agricultural economy. These are all fine, but ultimately it is the 10% of the people in our country who call the shots. So therefore, what is Indian in Indian economy? That is number one. Number two is whatever little report and information that we have been reading now, the number of billionaires in India and in the world, they continue to increase their wealth even in COVID situation. That's the reality. If you look at the stock market, there is no major collapse in the the stock exchange, right? So this is another puzzling factor for me. So I would like to be enlightened by the eminent thinkers here. Thank you.
What is that 10% you mentioned, Pepin? What is that 10%?
10% of the Indian population is owning 77% of the national wealth.
Yeah.
Okay, this is the latest Oxfam report on inequality. I mean,
that is true worldwide. I mean,
yeah.
That is a serious concern to which this panel, I don't expect to have an answer to that, because that's a long-term this thing, which has been going on, and the
so therefore, what is Indian economy then? Let us call it economy of these 10 people, right? Why do you call it Indian economy?
No, you can talk about, if you look at it from that perspective, yes. But, that secular tendency, which is the reversal of what Kuznets talked about, which has been proved to be flawed, that Kuznets inverted U-shape doesn't work. Now, this study, what is that famous French economist, his study shows very clearly that it is, if anything, it is a normal U curve, that it has gone down in the around the middle of the 20th century. It is now creeping up, and it is going to go up more and more. So that is a secular tendency happening everywhere. He has shown. That name escapes me. The famous man, the French economist. Anyway, so that is something. But then, Professor Pepin, we have to discuss this irrespective of the secular tendency. We have to discuss the immediate problem and the proximate reasons and possible policy issues emanating from the COVID-19 pandemic. We really have to work for it, because otherwise the worst affected people are the poorest of the lot. So that tendency that you mentioned would get aggravated. Poverty would increase even more. Inequality would sharpen even more. If we can't protect, at least to some extent, from the fallout of this kind of a tragedy, even if you couldn't give that, even that 5 kilo rice and 1 kilo dal and that 500 rupees that the government has given, even that would not be coming. Yes, Professor Sarkar, I think, or Sugata mentioned that there is a propensity to save, probably you mentioned. But that apart, you don't even have the cushion then. We have to live with certain realities, but I agree, your point, your observation is absolutely correct. But then we also have to intervene in the short run to see to what extent we can cushion the worst affected people. That would be my response, but then other panelists can.
Yes, Professor Matjit.
I think Professor Matjit has something to say. Yes, yeah. Professor Matjit.
Yes, just a reaction to Professor Pipik's comment and question, and an extension of Professor Roy's remark. I think couple of things we have to be very clear. First of all, that yes, India really is one of the worst performers so far as the wealth inequality is concerned. True that if you look at the country and say that only 10% of people command so much of wealth, what has happened to this country? And that is, I think, a very, very, very reasonable question that Professor Pipik is asking. But I just would like to mention a few things, that in 1950s, India's rate of poverty was around more than 60%, or maybe even before independence, you can go to phases where it was more than 60% in many places. The question is that now, even with so much of debate, we we still agree that the rate of poverty has gone down substantially. Number one. Number two, the fact that here not only those 10% of people, they decide the political fate of this country. You know, this is a large democratic country, so every person has a vote. That means, that's why you find that the government of India, whoever there is in power, or governments in the state, whoever is in the power, they cannot ignore the affairs of the poor people. They have to, that's why Norega has come about, that's why bank nationalization has come about, that's why so many things have come about. So while it is really a pain, it's really an agony that we have to live with, but as Professor Ray has mentioned, that we still have to steer ahead with the idea that actually the citizens of this country must not suffer due to this kind of disaster. So the question, I think, is that India should have done much better. It could not. But that does not say that India has not done anything at all. Because if you look at our country 50 years, 80 years in the past and now, you would see people's aspirations have increased. It's not that people are stuck at a particular position. So I think that if you look at the access to education, access to public inputs, and if you remember, if you just take an estimate, very rough estimate, provision of public inputs, provision of public good, just 50 years ago, just 60 years ago, you will find that the relative access must have improved in favor of the poor people. So there are certain, I think, achievements, but at the same time, these guys are most affected when this kind of natural disaster kicks in. So that's why Professor Rice is repeatedly saying that actually secular movements, we cannot do much, and our history, our activities, our politics is such that we can blame. But the point is, the reality says that we have to protect those guys, who are, let's say, bottom 30%, bottom 40%, because now their income is zero, almost zero. So in that way, I think that's the relevance of economic policy making in a very unequal world. But you also look at the positive sides of our achievements to some extent.
Thank you, Professor Matjit. So we have a next question from Bishan Shannal. So if he is available in this, Bishan, yeah, he is available. Hello. Hello. Yeah.
So, Tanmoy, you asked the question.
Yeah, he is here. He is here. Yeah, Mr. Bishan, you can ask your queries to the panelists. Yeah.
My question is, as the government is compelled to lock down the economy, stop production, we know from the concept of MEC that people take loan to produce. But whoever has taken loan, especially MSMEs and small agriculture producers, they cannot produce due to the announcement. So why moratorium? Why not it is interest waiver? At least for the MSMEs and small agricultural producers.
Who is going to answer?
Group sir, you want?
Who is going to respond to that?
Yes, Professor Sarkar can respond.
My preference would certainly be for a waiver, but the question is whether the government is in a position to bear such a burden. Someone has to bear the burden, and this is number one. And number two, there could be some units who are actually able to pay, and they will not pay. Even those who are in a position to pay, will take this opportunity of not paying. So now there is I'm sure I completely agree with you that a 6-month moratorium will basically add up to the load of the person who has taken the loan. But then if it's a straight-off moratorium to everyone,
not for everyone. Not for everyone. Like poverty line, we can demarcate it. We can demarcate it.
See, one problem is that. So if we are talking about fairness, right? Suppose we talk about units which are small and we give waiver to them, right? That's fine. But just consider those units which are unregistered and which cannot be, are not recorded, for example. There are hundreds and thousands of them who are taking loans from the local money lender, right? So, shouldn't the government do something about them? I mean, why should the entire, package be geared towards those who are registered? Uh, so there are problems, there are problems of distribution. It's waiver. I'm in favor of waiver in many cases, but one has to be very, very careful as far as waiver is concerned. And waiver should come as a last resort, as in the case of agriculture, also in the case of industry. That's my opinion. Anyway, other panelists might have other views.
Thank you very much. Just I want to ask our panelists if they have a time to answer only 2 questions, and they are very junior students. So can I move forward?
No, I am prepared to sit for longer time. I am prepared to sit for
No,
longer
no,
time.
yeah, obviously.
But ask others.
Yeah, also others. Uh, so this is one of our student. He's a 3rd year student, and she already got her gave the final semester. So Kavya, why don't you ask the question directly to the respected panelists? Hello. Okay, she is there. Yeah. Kavya, you unmute yourself. Yeah.
Hello.
Yes.
Hello.
Yes, you are audible.
Good evening to all the my question of course the pandemic has a very direct health impact on the affecting the COVID patients, but I would like to know the comments about how it is indirectly affecting the health of the economy, like the informal sector which is suffering from starvation and everything, and also there is reduced health access to the newborn babies or the mothers, or even I read a case that the primary health workers of the country are presently working for the COVID pandemic situation. So they are not able to cater to the vaccine vaccine requirement of the country, and many of the polio vaccinations which should have taken place during this time have not taken place. So it may have long run health impacts on the lives of the people of the economy. So I just wanted to know how all these would have how all these would affect the social and the psychological well-being of the labor force, and hence the productivity of the labor force in the long run.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so who answers? Maybe I can just chip in with a few points.
Yes, sir.
Is that okay?
Definitely.
Well, you see, Kavya, this was probably expected, and that's the reason the lockdown happened in the first place. You see, our resources are never enough, even in the regular times. And during a crisis like this, when everybody might potentially get affected and fall sick, depending on the degree of seriousness that they're exposed to, the hospital system, the number of doctors and medical care professionals we have in the country, or perhaps in any country of the world, is completely, insufficient to cater to a mass influx of patients in the hospital system, right? So once this epidemic or pandemic happens, then people are trying to trying to actually take care of the more exigent or more urgent needs of the according to the crisis, keeping aside all regular issues, including mental health, including catering to babies. And I also hear, I similarly reflect like you, that cancer patients are not probably getting their treatments from time to time. There are other serious patients who are deferring their visits to the doctors and to the hospital just because it simply would not accommodate the additional pressure of looking at regular patients apart from those who are affected by the COVID thing. Now, this is something which is probably linked to what I was also trying to tell you, that number one, you see, human capital doesn't get formed overnight. So training of doctors, nurses, and healthcare professionals would take time. And it would also depend strictly on the amount of infrastructure that's available in particular region, right? So for example, the southern states, perhaps, which is already quite endowed with the hospital facilities, a much better facility compared to the rest of the country, can handle the crisis better compared to some other states where the hospital facility, the number of doctors, the number of trained professionals are relatively less. So the question is how quickly we adjust the infrastructure and the human capital, and as a response to a crisis, can we really gear up to make some kind of a parity across regions so that there is a possibility of spreading out the pressure of additional loads in times like this much more equitably across places, and relying on the local support and local support system to cater to patients apart from those affected by the pandemic. And that would have actually not required the lockdown to happen in the first place. If we had enough medical resources to be supplied to people, then lockdown was absolutely unnecessary.
Thank you, Professor Kaur. I think we are at the end of this discussion. So before ending, I would like to thank Dr. Sandip Sarkar, because without his help, it was not possible to conduct this webinar. I mean, I have really heartiest thanks and gratitude towards him. So I would request Professor Sarkar to say something as a closing remarks. So Professor Sarkar, please.
Thank you all for, thank you, Abhirup sir, Sugata sir, and Shoeble. Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
For joining this panel, and also we never thought initially that we'll get this kind of response, because when we realized yesterday we had to close our link at 10 p.m. because the number of the participants already crossed 600. Okay, so the registered participant, but eventually the number of participants turned out here is actually something around 250, 260, and now I'm very happy actually to see that there are still more than 200 participants still are here. So, and many of you actually have asked about the feedback form. Please we will actually send you in link for the feedback. We will send you the link for sending us feedbacks, and also for future updates you can actually follow our Facebook page, where you will actually get the details. And I will just, before I concluding this, before I will just thank to all my professors, to Abhirup sir, to Sugata sir, and also Shoeble. Okay, thank you all once again. And also, I mean, I'm really happy the kind of cooperation I got from our honorable Father Tony, the Vice Chancellor, and also from our Registrar, Father Augustine. So yeah, so I will like to just conclude here by saying you this. Thank you all.
Adding with Sandip, I would like to thank also our IT guys, because they have helped for us for the technical support. They helped us a lot. So
they also did a dummy
trial
with us. Yes.
Thank you, sir, for being with us here. We are really honored that you people came, and this is our first conference. So really thanks.
And those who have missed the questions, just actually you can send your questions directly to the speakers, and yes, you can, or you can send to our Facebook page. We will send the questions. We will try to address to the questions, or we'll send to the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you. Log out then. Yeah. Okay. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.